the loud buzz of the steel gate broke the silence, followed by the heavy slam that echoed through the corridor. Every door on Range 13 locked in perfect rhythm, boom, 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 like a drumbeat of control. Inside those concrete boxes were men whose names once filled headlines, whose actions changed history, and whose lives now fit into 7-by-12-foot cells. On that morning, guards whispered to each other as a new arrival stepped through the gates, an inmate so infamous that even the most hardened prisoners fell silent. His name was Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber. The young man's eyes were blank, unreadable. He was about to meet the ghosts of history, men whose crimes had made them both legendary and forgotten inside America's toughest prison, ADX Florence, the Alcatraz of the Rockies. But this morning wasn't normal. As officers led Tsarnaev past the range, another inmate, Terry Nichols, co-conspirator of the Oklahoma City bombing, suddenly began shouting from his cell. His voice cracked through the cold air, "Another one! Another one joins the graveyard of the living." The corridor went silent again. The officers ignored him and kept walking. The new inmate disappeared behind another steel door, the sound of the lock closing like a final heartbeat. For outsiders, ADX Florence is just a name, a place where the worst of the worst are kept. But for the men inside, it's a world built from silence, shadows, and memories that never fade. Years before Tsarnaev's arrival, the prison already held some of the most dangerous and famous inmates in American history. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, spent his days here in complete isolation, reading books and writing notes in tiny handwriting that no one else would see. He rarely spoke to anyone, even through the food slot. Officers said he lived like a ghost, calm, polite, and unervingly quiet. Some said he'd memorized the sound of every door in the unit. Next door, Ramzi Yousef, the mastermind behind the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, was known for pacing non-stop. Guards joked that if you stood outside his door long enough, you could time your watch to his footsteps. He once told a psychologist that he didn't believe in time anymore, because time stopped when the world forgot about me. And then there was Robert Hansen, the FBI agent who sold secrets to Russia for years. A man who once had access to the nation's most protected intelligence now spent 23 hours a day staring at the walls of a cell. Staff said he spoke softly, prayed often, and refused to talk about his past. To the guards, he wasn't a spy anymore, just another number in an orange jumpsuit. Even Richard Reed, the British shoe bomber, lived just a few doors away. He'd been caught trying to blow up an airliner with explosives hidden in his shoes. Now, his world was reduced to 3 books, a steel bed, and a narrow slit of sky. He rarely came out for rec. When he did, he looked up, not at the guards, but at the open air above, like he was waiting for something to fall from heaven. Life at ADX was built on silence, but sometimes, silence broke. One night, long after lights out, guards heard faint tapping on the pipes, messages traveling through the plumbing system. It was a secret code the inmates used to talk to each other. Some said it was harmless, just lonely men trying to remember their voices. Others said it was more dangerous, plans whispered through steel and concrete. A few months later, that same tapping would be the sound of trouble, but before that night came, daily life continued in its strange rhythm. Every morning, the inmates received their meals through the slot, plastic trays with oatmeal, rice, or chicken. No metal utensils, no contact. Exercise was allowed 1 hour a day, alone, in a small yard that looked more like a cage than freedom. Some men used that hour to walk in slow circles. Others sat and stared at the sky, tracing the clouds as if they were old friends. Despite the rules, officers said the inmates found ways to communicate. A flick of a mirror, a quick glance through a crack, a reflection on a window. Tiny rebellions that gave them a piece of control in a world where control was everything. But there was one man who stood apart from the rest. His name was Joaquin, El Chapo Guzmán, the Mexican drug lord who had escaped from 2 prisons before. When he arrived at ADX Florence, the media swarmed outside, helicopters circling above. Inside, however, there was no noise. The prison treated him like any other inmate. On his first day, El Chapo was given his uniform, his number, and his silence. Guards said he smiled faintly, as if already planning another escape. But ADX Florence wasn't like any other prison. The cells were built so no one could dig, break, or tunnel. Even sound couldn't travel properly through the walls. He quickly learned that this time, there would be no tunnels, no bribed guards, no chance to run. Still, something about his arrival changed the air inside ADX. Inmates who hadn't spoken in years began trying to make contact again, sending coded knocks and reflections of light. Rumors spread among staff that El Chapo was trying to reach other famous prisoners. No one knew if it was true, but even a whisper at ADX was enough to cause a lockdown. Then came the day it all went wrong. That IT started like any other morning: count time, breakfast trays, the shuffle of footsteps on concrete. But in one unit, a guard noticed something strange. A folded piece of paper lay inside the food slot of Ted Kaczynski's cell. No one had sent him mail. When the officer picked it up, it wasn't a letter, it was a list of names. Names of inmates. Every one of them a high-profile prisoner. And at the bottom, in tiny handwriting, was a line that made his blood run cold: they still talk. Within minutes, the range went on emerge. NCY lockdown. Lights flashed, alarms buzzed, and every officer on duty moved in perfect formation. Doors slammed, radios crackled, and the echo of boots filled the corridor. Inside his cell, El Chapo stood still, his eyes fixed on the door. Across the hall, Ramzi Yousef pressed his ear to the vent, listening. Somewhere farther down, Tsarnaev whispered something under his breath, a prayer, maybe, or a message, and then, from the end of the range, faint but clear, came the sound everyone had been waiting for: tap. Tap tap. Tap. The pipes were speaking again. The guard froze. "Control, this is range 13, he said into the radio. "We've got movement, and it's coming from every cell." The sound grew louder, faster, spreading through the walls like heartbeat after heartbeat. The tapping turned into rhythm. Then into chaos. Then, silence. No one moved. Finally, the warden's voice came through the speaker: "Lock every range. No movement until further notice." The guards obeyed. The lights dimmed. The cameras kept rolling, and in the cold stillness of ADX Florence, a secret passed through the walls that no one could see, but everyone could hear, because even in America's most secure prison, silence doesn't mean peace. It means something's about to happen. For 3 days after the lockdown, ADX Florence went completely silent. No exercise, no mail, no movement. Every inmate stayed sealed inside his cell, and even the guards spoke in whispers. The echo of that strange synchronized tapping still haunted the staff. No one knew what it meant, or who had started it. The warden ordered a full internal investigation. Cameras were reviewed, sound logs checked, walls scanned for hidden wires or tools. Nothing. No one could explain how multiple inmates, separated by steel and concrete, could all tap in rhythm like that. The official report called it coincidental noise patterns. But the guards who were there that night knew better. They'd heard something too organized, too deliberate. Something that felt like communication. In Unit H, where most of the high-profile inmates were housed, life began returning to its mechanical rhythm. The lights flicked on at 6 a.m. sharp. The steel doors clicked open just long enough for trays to slide through. But even though things looked normal, the men inside weren't the same. Something had shifted. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, began refusing his books. He told a guard he didn't need them anymore. Ramzi Yousef stopped pacing and instead sat for hours staring at the wall, unmoving. Robert Hansen, the former FBI agent, requested a Bible and nothing else. And El Chapo Guzmán, he started smiling again. That worried the staff most of all. A week later, during a routine security inspection, a guard named Daniels was checking cell vents with a fiber-optic camera. When he reached El Chapo's cell, the lens flickered, static for half a second, then refocused. What Daniels saw made him step back. Carved faintly into the concrete under the vent were 4 letters, TDA. That he knew immediately what that meant. Ted Kaczynski, but how could it be there? The 2 men had never been within speaking distance. Each was kept under strict isolation, never allowed to interact, never even sharing the same exercise yard. Daniels reported it up the chain. The warden called it graffiti, nothing more. Still, an unease spread through the staff. By now, some officers swore they were hearing sounds again at night. Not tapping this time, whispers. Faint voices echoing through the vents, like someone reading or chanting quietly. One rookie guard quit after 2 shifts, saying he could hear someone calling his name from inside an empty cell, but this wasn't superstition. There was something real happening. 2 months after the lockdown, a journalist from the Denver Post filed a request for information about inmate behavior in the control units. The request was denied. But through an internal source, she got a copy of an unusual report written by Dr. Ellen Parker, one of the prison psychologists. It said, several high-profile inmates have begun demonstrating synchronized behavior patterns, despite complete isolation. Subjects respond to unknown auditory or sensory stimuli. The source cannot be identified. Dr. Parker wanted to interview El Chapo to find out more. It took weeks to get approval. When she finally sat down in the secure visiting room, glass between them, microphones recording, she began with a simple question: "Do you know why you're here?" He smiled faintly. Everyone here knows why they're here. But not everyone knows where they really are. She frowned. "You're at ADX Florence. You've been here since 2019. He nodded. "Yes. But sometimes, at night, it feels like the walls move." "What do you mean, they move?" "The sound," he said, tapping lightly on the table. "It comes and goes. Like a message." She leaned forward. "A message from who?" "El edificio habla," he said softly. "The building speaks." When Dr. Parker asked what it said, El Chapo just laughed. And leaned back. "Ask the bomber. He hears it better than I do." That night, Dr. Parker couldn't sleep. The next morning, she requested to check on Ted Kaczynski. He hadn't moved in hours. The guard opened the door. Ted was sitting cross-legged on his bed, eyes open, completely still. On the wall behind him, written faintly in pencil, were 3 words: "It's not over." Dr. Parker ordered a wellness check and had the writing photographed before it was scrubbed off. But something about the message felt deliberate, as if it wasn't just from him. Meanwhile, on the other side of the prison, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev had begun sketching in his notebook, symbols, lines, shapes that didn't make sense. When questioned, he said they were blueprints for the mind. He claimed he dreamed of a man tapping on the wall and whispering, "We're still connected." The staff dismissed it as psychological deterioration from isolation. But when his drawings were compared to the symbols once found in Ted Kaczynski's seized journals, they were eerily similar. By mid-year, the behavior had spread. At least 5 inmates, all held in separate units, had reported hearing voices or receiving messages through their vents. Each one mentioned the same phrase: "We never stop communicating." The warden called an emergency meeting. "This ends now," he said. "No more ghost stories. No more leaks. If anyone asks, it's mass stress, nothing more." But that night, during the 10 p.m. check, Officer Daniels noticed something strange. All the lights on Range 13 dimmed, just for a second, and when they came back on, the hallway camera blinked offline. He rushed to the monitor room. When the feed returned, the screen showed something that stopped his breath. For the first time in the history of ADX Florence, multiple inmates, El Chapo, Ramzi Yousef, Richard Reed, and even Tsarnaev, were all standing at their cell doors at the same moment, facing the same direction, motionless. Silent. Their eyes were fixed on the far end of the hall, on the cell that once belonged to Ted Kaczynski. Then, one by one, they raised their hands. Each tapped once on the steel door, tap, 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 tap. 4 beats, perfectly in sync. Daniels shouted for backup. But when the officers arrived, every inmate had already returned to bed. The hallway was quiet again. The next morning, the warden reviewed the footage. It showed exactly what Daniels had described, except for one detail: the cell at the end of the hall, Ted Kaczynski's old cell, appeared completely dark. The number plate was missing. And where the door slot should have been, there was only a faint light flickering from inside. The warden ordered maintenance to inspect it immediately. When the team opened the door, the cell was empty. nothing inside but one sheet of paper lying in the middle of the floor. Written on it, in neat handwriting, were the names of every inmate on the range, and one new name at the bottom, Officer Daniels. The guards stared at each other. Someone whispered, "How did they know his name?" But Daniels didn't hear it. He was already gone, his radio left on the floor near the entrance gate. No one ever saw him again, and from that night on, the guards swore that when the lights went out in ADX Florence, you could still hear it, faint, steady, and patient, tap. Tap tap. Tap.